Benvolgut degà, professor Walter García Fontes, benvolgut cap de la UCA, professor Daniel Serra, benvolguts companys i companyes de la facultat i del departament, benvolguts alumnes, amigues i amics. Parlaré la meitat en català i la meitat en anglès. Permeteu-me que comenci dient que avui estic aquí més que com a rector de la universitat, com a professor d'aquesta facultat, com a company de molts dels professors que ens acompanyeu avui i també com a professor d'alguns dels alumnes que us incorporeu enguany a la facultat, perquè aquest any i els següents la meva intenció és continuar impartint algunes classes. Em sembla fonamental mantenir el contacte directe, personal i proper amb els estudiants i amb els companys professors. Aquest és un any important en la Universitat Pompeu Fabra en el que estem posant en marxa diverses iniciatives. Algunes són de llum llarga i algunes són de llums curtes. De llums llargues hi ha iniciatives molt importants en el camp del finançament, de la internacionalització, de la recerca, de la docència, de les mesures per intentar reduir les precarietats que hi ha a la universitat. Però us parlaré ara molt breument d'algunes iniciatives de llums curtes, de curt termini, perquè afecten o impacten en els estudiants. Sabeu que des de fa uns dies a la facultat ja hi ha la docència presencial. Esperem també que demà hi haurà unes noves normatives sanitàries que permetran funcionar pràcticament d'una manera molt similar a la situació pre-Covid, tot i que haurem de seguir portant mascaretes i fer tota una sèrie de prevencions. Us volia parlar en aquest sentit del nou model docent, Evolució, que la Pompeu Fabra va començar a treballar ja fa 4 o 5 anys per intentar fer front a una situació important, que és que el sistema universitari està quedant-se enrere en relació a la velocitat a la que s'està movent el món. El món va més ràpid que el sistema universitari. La Pompeu Fabra això ho va detectar fa uns anys i precisament el model Evolució és el que és la mesura, el model docent que creiem que pot permetre a la universitat anar al mateix ritme de velocitat amb la que està canviant el món. És un model que implica canvis importants en la docència, en el que són les hores de grup gran, de classe, a la relació entre el professorat i els alumnes, els grups de treball, etc. Per altra banda, també hem posat en marxa fa molt poques setmanes el que en diem els equips de resposta ràpida per millorar aspectes de gran rellevància com els horaris, la càrrega administrativa de la docència, la càrrega administrativa de la recerca, el programa alumní, entre d'altres. És una iniciativa que té per objecte posar en marxa mesures de millora que es vegin ja al cap de 90 dies, per tant, més o menys a final d'any. Una altra mesura molt important que veureu a partir del gener és el que en diem el passaport UPF. El passaport UPF és com un certificat de notes on, a més, s'hi posin totes aquelles activitats, moltes d'elles no directament acadèmiques, però relacionats amb la vida universitària, com pot ser la participació en associacions estudiantils o la participació en temes culturals, aula de teatre, el cor de la UPF, etc. Són exemples d'iniciatives en les que us animem a implicar-vos. Enguany comenceu a la Facultat d'Economia i Empresa més de 750 estudiants entre els programes d'Economia, AD, Ciències Empresarials Management, IB, el doble grau en Dret i el grau de Tecnologies Industrials i Anàlisi Econòmica que impartim amb la UPC. De tots aquests, el 53% dels estudiants sou dones. Constatem, doncs, que almenys en els estudis dels àmbits d'Economia i Empresa no hi ha gap de gènere en el moment d'entrar a la universitat. Però anem a veure què passa després. In her speech, Professor Bertrand will address the topic of gender inequality. Let me say a few things about women's career evolution at this university. At the undergrad level, women are not underrepresented in the student body. On the contrary, there are more women students than men, 61% against 39% in the last academic year. Actually, at UPF, the field with the fewest women students is engineering, and the university has already implemented several strategies to encourage more women to apply in this field, such as the Mentoring Female Engineering Students program. At the graduate and postgraduate level, there is a slight change of trend with around 40% female grad students, PhD students, and postdoc, versus 60% men. So, at the graduate and postgraduate level, the gap increases. The problem comes with the transition to leadership roles. After the postdoctoral stage, the transition to leadership roles is biased, with only approximately 31% of women achieving a permanent position at UPF. So we start with 60% at the undergrad level, 40% when we arrive to the grad level, and 30% when we arrive to the leadership positions. Unfortunately, the glass ceiling is still a reality within the university wall. I might add that this happened in most Western European universities where, despite women outnumbering men at the undergrad level, the number of female full professors is still low. According to some European studies, various reasons have been proposed for the glass ceiling effect, such as the traditional division of household tasks and childcare responsibilities, sex stereotyping, or even bias in recruitment and selection procedures. I am sure that this is not the case of UPF, but anyway, we cannot let this happen in universities. We need to strengthen our gender policies in order to achieve effective equality. We are fully committed to that, and since UPF's second equality plan comes to an end in 2022, we will carry out a new analysis and we will approve a new equality plan according to the current needs. I'm going to stop here. I have to give the floor to Professor Bertrand for her to pronounce the opening lecture. Dr. Marianne Bertrand is Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. She's also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Center for Economic Policy Research, and the Institute for the Study of Labor. She is an international expert in the fields of labor economics, corporate finance, and development economics, among others. I am sure her opening lecture, entitled Gender Inequality in the Labor Market, is highly worth hearing. Thank you very much. Moltes gràcies.
Thanks everybody for coming. Is it okay if I take the mask off from here? Okay, great, I'll do that. Okay, thanks. Thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. It is really strange. I think it's the first time I'm in an in-person, event like this for 22 months. So thanks a lot for being brave enough to deal with the new world. So what I want to do over the next hour or so is give you kind of a rendition of, I think I was invited to come here last year, clearly didn't work, but what I would have, I think, pretty much talked about last year, plus maybe a few things kind of related to COVID. All right. So in terms of, introductions, when, think about the topic of gender inequality, I think in light of everything else that's happening, in the world, in the economy, and, really increasing inequalities along many, many dimensions and signs of decreasing social mobility, I think the gender angle to the inequality stories is actually quite an optimistic one, right? So there's been steady progress really throughout the world in terms of women's access to the labor force and also evidence of reducing gender gaps in achievement and earnings. So this is the world. The x-axis is GDP per capita, and you can see that, across all countries, we've seen over the last 25 years or so, increase in women's labor force participations. That's true at every level of economic development. I think behind, this progress is just steady progress as well when it comes to girls schooling. Again, kind of putting all the countries in the world on the x-axis by order of economic development, you can see that where there was back 25 years ago, fewer women than men kind of completing primary and secondary schoolings, we are moving very quickly towards equality of schooling achievement throughout the world between girls and boys. And there's a lot of kind of good research as to what's behind this, whether it is kind of building more infrastructure, introducing conditional cash transfer program to incentivize girls' schooling, family planning policies. A lot of things are behind this progress. When you start focusing on the developed countries, which is what I will be doing for most of the rest of this lecture, you see, kind of a similar story. And in fact, as I think the rector was mentioning, we have evidence throughout the developed world that there are way more girls than boys, kind of going to universities and completing tertiary education. I think that story is true for every country in OECD data besides Japan. All right. Signs of, kind of where are we in terms of gender gaps in labor force participation and pay? Well, again, that's the OECD, and as I was staring at this picture, I don't see Spain, and I think Spain is part of the OECD, so I think the reason that Spain might have been slow in getting the data to the OECD, I have no other explanation as to why Spain is not on this graph. But you can see, kind of in terms of pay gap, women making about, on average, 15 cents less than men. The US is actually quite, representative of the OECD average in terms of both the gender gap in labor force participation and the gender gap in pay. And the trends, as I was mentioning, are all going in the right direction. So even if you look at the past, kind of 12 years, you see, kind of most of the countries, in this box over there, that is, kind of consistent with decline in the gender gap in pay and decline in the gender gap in labor force participation. So really kind of continued steady progress. Some countries like Finland are not moving much because they're already doing very well. Some countries like the US are not moving much, not so much because they're doing well, but because the US is kind of more stagnant in terms of further reducing gender gap. I think the final part of the story that I want to say in terms of kind of laying out, the environment is that we have this evidence of a glass ceiling, which is that women are indeed, kind of over time entering the labor force at a higher rate, right? This is US data, about like 40 years of US data. But then when you think about kind of women's representation in the upper part of the earnings distribution, right? Whether it is 50th percentile, 80th percentile, 90th percentile, you see continued women underrepresentation, right? So, for example, what you would expect if things were equal to have about 10% of women earning above the 90th percentile of the male's earnings, you only have by 2010 about 2.7% of these women. So women are very much underrepresented in the upper part of the earnings distribution. You can zoom in on this underrepresentation, this glass ceiling, kind of with administrative data, which with tax data, which unlike the administrative data that is used here, that census data doesn't have any censoring. This is data from the US, tax data in the US, data from France, tax data, and you can see again that the higher up you go into the earnings distribution, the fewer is women's representation. And, again, progress mainly over the 1980s, and a sense of like some plateauing in terms of kind of increasing the share of women at the top. So I think this is some of the best pictures that we have on the glass ceiling phenomenon. I want to just talk a little bit, kind of have a few slides about COVID and what COVID is doing to all of this progress. I think this is obviously going to be a very important kind of research agenda going forward. It is very clear, though, that the progress that I've discussed, especially in terms of women's increased labor force participation, has kind of come to a halt with the COVID crisis. This is data from a paper that has looked across a wide range of countries, and it's looked at the very early stages of the crisis. This is back to the second quarter of 2020, but you can see that in a vast majority of countries, female employment has gone down relative to male employment during the crisis. If you try to do this not so much in terms of actual changes, but predicted changes, typically when a recession hits, it tends to be hitting men more than women, right? So if you were to kind of predict the changes you would have expected to female employment, you would expect women to do better over those months because of recession. In fact, all of the countries kind of underperformed. So women clearly kind of saw their position in the labor market affected quite strongly by COVID. This is very short term. If you look at the US, where we have kind of data that goes a little longer, you can see, kind of the very large 2 percentage point decline in female employment in the first few months of COVID and the signs of a recovery, but by the end of 2020, women were not back to where they were. Now, I'll talk a bit more about, kind of this crisis and what it means in the rest of the talk. All right. So with this background in mind, kind of what I want to spend, most of the rest of the time doing is just trying to understand what are the remaining pain points for women, right? So steady progress, but like very, still quite far from, gender equality. Kind of what do we believe are the key forces driving this? And I'm going to take, for most of the lecture, a developed world kind of perspective on this, but I'll go back a little bit to, kind of a cross-country, kind of a broader cross-country approach. And my reading of the literature, including some, but a very small fraction of it being, my own work, is that some of the key factors, quantitatively really important factors to explain why women are still lagging behind, really do not have to do with gender discrimination per se. They have to do with, factors that are consistent with equal pay for equal labor market work between the genders, right? So the set of choices that, women and men make that I think are first order in explaining why women still earn less than men and still are underrepresented in the labor market. And I'll talk about two things in the next few slides. One is continued gender differences in educational choices, and the theme, the theme that the rector has already kind of brought up. And the second one is, sharp gender differences in the labor market penalties associated with becoming a parent. So let me just, kind of discuss both of these points and, try to convince you that indeed quantitatively they are important ones. So first, kind of educational choices. And, as you remember, kind of right now we are in a moment where, there's way more women going to universities than there are men. I mean, I think, in fact, this is a phenomenon that we still don't fully understand, but I think it's a phenomenon that, kind of more and more people are concerned about and trying to understand, kind of what's holding kind of men's back in terms of, tertiary education. Now, with that being said, it is not true that women and men make the same choices when they go and complete and pursue a tertiary degree. And what is remarkable is that across all rich nations, women are heavily underrepresented in the STEM, right? So the rector talked about engineering. This is, kind of engineering, math, computer science, physics. You can see that across countries uniformly, there are way, way fewer women than men kind of completing these degrees, right? So why is that important? Because a lot of these degrees are actually, kind of leading to good jobs. And women are staying away from, from these jobs and the earnings associated with them. That's balanced by, kind of more women in the humanities and, in business and law, kind of things that look more balanced. All right, so again, why does this matter? Because these degrees have different kind of earnings potential associated with them, right? So in one way to try to kind of think about that is with a picture like this, where I track birth cohorts over time, and I assign to, every individual in this birth cohort a measure of potential earnings simply based on the degree that they chose to pursue, right? So associate a given degree with a certain measure of earnings coming from the man's earnings in these degree, right? And then compute for every birth cohort the gender gap in potential earnings simply due to the degree that you chose to pursue. right? And you can do that based on average earnings in those degree field, or 80th percentile earning, or 90th percentile earnings in those degree field, right? Do that, and this is the picture that you observe. So you can see that there's been convergence between men and women in the degree that they chose. These lines are sloping down, but that convergence has kind of plateaued since about my birth cohort, right? So going back to the 1950s birth cohort, women would choose fields of study that would lead to about 20% lower 90th percentile earnings than men. By the 1990s birth cohort, you still have a 10% difference, right? So women are choosing to enter fields that are associated with lower potential earnings. The reason why this also matters is that it's not just that women are selecting fields that are associated with lower percentage earnings. It is also the case that women are, so this is looking at another reasons of the the implications for earnings, is that by staying away from the STEM fields, which is I think the first order fact that we need to be concerned about, women are also staying away from occupations where they tend to earn more, something that is more in line with what the men are earning in those occupations. So what is this picture? It comes from Claudia Golding's presidential address back in 2014. Every dot here is one of the 95 highest earnings occupations in the US. The x-axis is the mean earnings for men in those occupations. And the y-axis is a gender gap in earnings between men and women, right? And what you can say here is like a downward sloping line, is that the higher the earnings of the occupation, the bigger is women's underperformance compared to men in those occupations. But what is particularly striking about this picture is that the different kind of colors indicate different fields. And if you look at tech and science, the green and the yellow, you can see that in these occupations, the pay gap between men and women is smaller. Right? So women are staying away from the STEM, which tend to be high earnings occupations, and also occupations where women tend to earn something that is more in line with what men earn, for reasons that I'll discuss in a few more slides. All right. So that's fact number one. Despite strong educational gain, despite being more educated than men, women choose fields where they earn less. The second really striking factor is in explaining women underperformance in the labor market is the labor market penalties that are associated with becoming a mother are very, very different than the labor market penalties associated with becoming a father. So these are pictures that come from, Clavin and Camille Landé's work and various co-authors. And I think these pictures are really striking. They are all based on administrative data set. So not every country is, represented here. But they all present very simple event study, right? Track the earnings of a man and a woman from the years before first becoming a parent and the subsequent years after becoming a parent. And, look at what happens. And here we have, 6 countries, Scandinavian countries, the UK and the US, and then we have Germany and Austria. What these pictures show is that becoming a father is essentially a non-event for men's earnings, right? You can see that, the red line is the first time you become a parent, and you can see that men's earnings are essentially unimpacted by this event. If you look at women, you have a very sharp reduction in earnings at the time, these women become mothers for the first time, and there's never a full recovery. Right? And you can see that this is true across these countries, but you can also see that the magnitudes are very different, right? It is, if you think about earnings losses for women in the long run, so say 5 to 10 years after first becoming a parent, it goes from a low of 21% in Denmark, right? You're 21% lower than if you had not been a child, to more than, if I believe, the number 60% in Germany. All right, so these are quantitatively very large effects. Another picture from Henrik and Camille's work that I really like is this picture from Denmark, right? So if you think about Denmark, we think about, kind of one of the most maybe gender equal society out there, right? And this picture is basically summarizing over time how can we explain the gender differences in learning between Danish men and women. And what you can see is that first, overall, there's been a decline in the gender pay gap in Denmark. And that the factors that I explained this gender pay gap have changed, right? Back in the 1980s, yes, there were educational differences that mattered in explaining why men were earning less than men. And there was also a big residual. You can label that whatever you want, discrimination, I don't know, whatever it is, a residual. And then the other big block is just gender inequality that's due to the parenthood phenomenon that I described before. And what's striking is that by the end of the time period they're looking at, essentially all of gender pay differences in Denmark are due to the gender inequality related to children. Everything else has disappeared. And what's also, I think, kind of depressing is that this child-related gender inequality has not shrunk at all over that 25 or so year period. So in a country like Denmark, the labor market penalties for having children essentially explain all of the gender gap at this point in time. All right. So what drives this motherhood penalty, we have also a lot of good research that is telling us what's behind it. Right? And you could say, well, maybe that's evidence of discrimination against mothers. Maybe there's no discrimination against women, but maybe there's discrimination against mothers. I think the facts that we see in the data do not suggest that it's that. There's a clear labor supply responses that happens when a woman becomes a mom. So in some cases, just straight exit from the labor force or switch to part-time work on reduction in hours worked, right? And, kind of there could be a lot of factors beside that. I mean, in the US, the affordability of childcare is a big factor. Every mom in the room knows that, kind of the length of the school day and the length of the summer break really is difficult to combine with a full-time job. We also have evidence of not just reduction in number of hours worked, but also reduction in hourly wage as women are looking for the additional flexibility that they need when they become mothers. So, in Scandinavia, for example, a big part of the phenomenon is that women move out of the private sector and start moving to the public sector, where there's more flexibility, but also lower hourly wage, or become self-employed. And then we also have good evidence that mothers have additional constraint on job search, some of them related to, geography, right? So there's good work from France that suggests that women will not be looking as far from their home for a job, and that these differences in, the ability to look further obviously reduces the pool of jobs that you could select, and also is an important factor in explaining why women earn less than men, which in itself I think is interesting in the world of COVID and the future of work post-COVID. This may become a less important forces. Now, what I want to stress with this slide is that while you may think that a lot of these explanations may only apply to, kind of women lower down in the potential earnings distribution, it is definitely not a fact. So I've done some work, kind of way back. Rosa has done some work as well, focusing on, women with high potential earnings. So MBAs, when we did a survey of our MBA students at Chicago Booth, Rosa did some work on lawyers, and all of this suggests, if you just look at the last column and week's work, for example, for the MBAs, that, female with MBAs from a very prestigious program also reduce their work hours when they become mothers, right? Story is very much that, kind of women without kids work as much, female MBAs without kids work as much as male MBA students. The group that reduces their hours are just those women that have children. I think Rosa finds a similar picture when she looks at female lawyers with young age children, which kind of have kind of a billing about 25% less in hours compared to men. So this is not, this labor supply responses kind of work through the entire potential earnings distribution. All right. part that, kind of, again, going back to Claudia Golden's work on this part, is that these responses that we see here among MBAs and lawyers, we know that they are particularly costly in terms of earnings. So we know that working fewer hours as an MBA is not being available to work on, on the Sundays, not being, available to take that trip, has very large earnings consequences. So this picture is the same one that I showed you before. The y-axis is the gender gap in earnings between men and women. The x-axis is the measure of the elasticity of annual income with respect to weekly hours. So the further you are on the right of this graph, right, you're looking at occupations where if you are indeed willing to work that 90-hour week rather than just 85 hours per week, you're going to make a lot of extra money, right? That's a measure, if you want, of like how inflexible the occupation is. And what this shows with this kind of downward sloping line is that the more inflexible the occupation is, the highest the reward for working long hours, the more difficult it is for women to maintain the same earnings as men within those occupations, right? So again, in summary, those labor supply responses in these high earnings occupations are particularly costly in terms of earnings for women. All right. I think the role of children in explaining, kind of gender differences in achievement, I think is also very well illustrated in this picture of the pandemic recession. Right? So what you see here is, it's from work by Michel Tertilt and others. It's looking at months since the beginning of two recessions. The Great Recessions back in 2008 and the pandemic recessions back in March or April of 2020. And you can see very clearly that this recession was very different. And it was very different for one particular group, which is women with children. And I think the story is pretty clear. School shut down. And when school shut down, well, in theory, it could have been, kind of symmetric as to who was going to step out of the labor force to take care of children. It was very clearly the woman that did that. All right? So I think this picture, to me, also very clearly says that this recession, which has been labeled a she-cession, different kind of recession because it didn't hit manufacturing. It hit, other sectors of the economy where women are more represented. It was a she-cession in part because of, indeed, its sectoral composition. The sectors of the economy that it hit were very different from your traditional recession. But it's not, the main reason why women got hit more by this recession. It was really because of all the disruption to childcare and schooling, and that's, I think, kind of the main forces that made it different. All right, so kind of transitioning now, kind of with all of these facts, and and hopefully I've convinced you that kind of educational choices, motherhood penalties are quantitatively really important in explaining what's going on. The question is, what do we make of all of this? Right? So, and I really think that there are two views out there one may have. Right? One view is that everything I showed you here just reflects men and women making self-interested calculations, deciding what's best for them to do, right? And deciding kind of how much, kind of labor to supply and, what to study based on their preferences or their skill, right? So one could look at the results I showed you so far and say that they essentially reflect different self-interested choices, and men and women that arrive at different outcomes because there are essential differences between them in terms of their preferences. Maybe women really do not like math, or maybe women really prefer engaging in caregiving activities than men. Or they end up in these different outcomes not so much because of difference in preferences, but difference in skills, right? Women are just not as good as math, so why would they be studying STEM? Or women have some kind of comparative advantage when it comes to child-rearing activities, right? If you start with this view, it's not clear that there's much that needs to be done in terms of like policy to correct the outcome that we have, right? People have got different skills, different preferences, and arrive at different outcomes. Now, a second view is that the different outcomes that we see are more a reflection of stereotypes. Stereotypes about what are gender-specific skills and what are gender-specific roles, right? And that both preferences and skills are not as much essential between the genders, but really endogenous to these stereotypes, okay? So what I would like to do in the next few slides is kind of run with this second view and try to convince you that, even though I think the jury is still out overall, there's a lot, kind of that you should, that this second view, deserves a fair shake and a fair evaluation. All right, so how am I going to do that? Well, first I need to talk a little bit about stereotypes. And, in economics, we don't really talk much about stereotypes, right? The closest we talk about stereotypes in economics is in our models of statistical discrimination, right? And in our models of statistical discrimination, which are essentially rooted in perfect, information, we view stereotypes as rational beliefs about a group of members and based on the aggregate distribution we have of the trait or the skill for that group member, okay? So stereotypes in economics are basically rational, belief-based discrimination. And stereotypes in economics are solely descriptive, right? So I have a view that, kind of, here's a black man, he's applying for a job. I have a sense on average of the differences in, traits between black men and white men, and I make my decision based on that. And my belief is rational, so, overall it's going to be a fair decision. It's only descriptive, beliefs about what men and women typically do or how they will be. There's quite a large differences between the treatment of stereotypes in economics and the treatment of stereotypes in social psychology. So social psychology do not, kind of believe that stereotypes need to be accurate or rational. It views stereotypes as basically kind of a rule of thumb, a generalization that make it easier to think about problems, right? It doesn't have to be that my stereotypes are right, that they are a good description of the average traits of each of the group. And then, very importantly, in social psych, we don't only think about stereotypes as being descriptive, but we also think about them as being prescriptive. So what do I mean by that? They are beliefs that, in fact, men and women share about what men and women ought to do or should do, right? And this prescriptive nature of the gender stereotypes are going to basically shape people's views, self-views, and behaviors, right? Of, kind of what they would do. That maps into something that has come into economics, which is the idea of gender identity norms. And certainly, I think the first paper to bring this idea of prescriptive stereotypes in economics is Akerlof and Crenton back in 2000. These stereotypes start entering our utility function, and they changes the way we behave, they changes our preferences. So I just want to go back for a moment to this kind of cross-country evidence that I started with, to kind of show you a few facts that, to me, kind of really justify the idea of thinking about these preferences as not being kind of something that we are born with, innate preferences, but really as being way more kind of endogenous preferences that are, kind of responsive or to these stereotypes. So this is data from the World Value Survey, and what I've mapped here is the share of men on the x-axis and women on the y-axis that believe that men have more of a right to a job than women, right? And I think to me what's striking, and everybody that kind of used World Value Survey data or GSS data before kind of knows this to be, to be true, is that you are very close to the 45-degree line, right? If you go to Egypt, it's not just men that tell you that, yeah, men have more of a right to work than women, which is, I think, what you expect. What this tells you, if you go to Egypt and you talk to women, you'll get a fairly similar answer, which is the women are telling you, yeah, guys have more of a right to job than women. You're very close to these 45, this 45-degree line. So the reason why why, kind of all of this matter is that when I started the contrast between view 1 and view 2, there was this idea that, kind of you have these preferences and they lead men and women to different calculations. When you think about the prescriptive nature of gender stereotypes, it also kind of leads to the same thing, but the preferences are now very much endogenous to stereotypes. Whether it is because these values have been internalized, right? Think about mother's guilt. When I decided to, take a trip, and come here and leave my kids alone, maybe the utility I get out of this trip is just lower than it is for a guy because I feel like I should be at home. I have internalized this into myself, or because of reputational consequences. Like, other moms are going to look at me and say, well, she's abandoning her kids to go and take a trip somewhere, right? It changes the way I think about things. It changes my preferences. And I think what's, I think to me important about this, and Cass Sunstein is really one of the persons I found to have written, the most nicely about this, is that, you're studying economics and, kind of, they tell you that as agents, we optimize given our preferences. And, kind of, we assume these preferences to be exogenous. And this basically leads you to question kind of where do these preferences come from? And that economics take a massive shortcut by telling us that we're born with certain preferences. And that, in fact, thinking about what preferences are and what is in people's self-interest and what's the right outcome becomes really, really tricky when you think that these preferences are basically internalizing a set of ambient cultural and gender norms. Let me just, kind of drill down on this point for, a little longer. This is the picture that I started with, right? This is, again, the world, GDP per capita, female labor force participation, and there's this well-known kind of U-shaped relationship that, has been documented. So, low level of economic development, high level of female labor force participation, higher level of economic development, higher level of female labor force participation, and then you've got this kind of saggy bottom over there. The story behind this, has always been one of like structural transformation, right? You've got countries, you've got countries over here that are mainly agricultural places, kind of you work on the farm, women are involved. You move in the middle, it's basically the rise of manufacturing. Kind of manufacturing is harder, kind of women get out of the workforce, and then you've got the rise of services and women kind of re-enter the workforce. And that might very well be the structural transformation, a good story for what has happened historically. If you look at the last 25 years and try to figure out whether there's a relationship between changes in the share of the GDP that's from agriculture, manufacturing, or services, and the change in female labor force participation, you essentially see a bunch of flat lines. There's really no evidence that structural transformation is explaining the changes in labor force participation, at least over the last 25 years. I think what's much more, to me, kind of salient is this picture, where again I have the world, but I have separated countries based on what I'm calling sexism here, but again, it's more gender role attitudes, which, as I just showed you, I could equally measure based on what women think or based on what men think. They would lead me to the same answer. And what you can see clearly here is that, this U shape is kind of a combination of more like two flat lines. One where you have high level of female labor force participation in places where more women and men believe that, kind of men don't have to come first when we're looking for jobs, versus another set of blue countries over there where a large share of women and men would say, men come first in the labor market. Right? And this U shape is more kind of like, a combination of these different levels of sexism. Belaboring this point a little bit more, right? And to get again at the idea of people adapt to this view of the world, what do you think kind of is a gender gap in happiness, across these countries in the world, right? Well, if this was really perceived as a constraint for women, you would expect much lower level of happiness for women in these blue countries. And there's none of that in the data. This is kind of Gallup World Poll surveys that I put together, and I look at the gender gap in life satisfaction, kind of how good you feel about your life. And you can see that across the world, there's a small gender gap in life satisfaction. Women overall, except for the very, very poor countries, tend to be happier than guys. But most importantly, right? You do not see in these middle-income countries where, there are higher level of let's call it sexism, any evidence that women are any less happy in those places. Even when women appear to be satisfied with such customs, so like Saudi Arabia, guardianship system where women cannot leave the home, we should probe more deeply. Someone who has no property rights under the law, who has had no formal education, who has no legal right to divorce, who will very likely be beaten if she seeks employment outside of the home, says that she endorses tradition of modesty, purity, and self-abnegation. It is not clear that we should consider this the last word on the matter. Right? I think that's a really good summary of what I've been trying to say here about the endogeneity of preferences to these stereotypes. All right, so now moving to not just endogenous preferences and prescriptive gender stereotype, but thinking about endogenous skills, right? There's a really important idea, which is that of self-fulfilling prophecies. Right? And we do have self-fulfilled prophecies in economics as well, right? But I think what's important is that once you combine the descriptive and prescriptive nature of gender stereotypes, then the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies becomes particularly important. And I'm going to talk about it in the context of math, and why women are underrepresented in the STEM. So in economics, we have self-fulfilling prophecies, and they're mainly driven by the descriptive part of stereotype, which is the one that we're concerned by, right? So if employers believe that black men are not going to be as good, as good employees, well, why would black men bother acquiring an education, right? So that gives you, endogenous skill responses, investment in skill responses among black men, right? That's the descriptive part. But the prescriptive part also creates something more mechanical, right? It's more internalized. I'm not supposed to be good at math. Right? If I'm not to be good at math, well, what's the point of studying math? And maybe I'm going to be less confident when I take a math test. Right? That is very much the stereotype threat literature that goes back to Steele and Aronson, and we have a lot of lab evidence that suggests that those stereotype threat, right? You get men and women to do a math test. In a case, you make their racial identity salient. In another case, you make the gender identity salient. Women are going to perform much worse in a case where you make the gender identity salient. Now, this, I think, is one important factor behind, women's underrepresentation in the STEM. There's a belief out there that, women's deficit in math is one reason why they do not study STEM. Now we have lots of good evidence, both at the micro level, but also at the macro level, suggesting that stereotypes are really one important factor behind women's underperformance in math. So there's a very nice paper by Carolina that was published, I think, 2 years ago in the QJE. They have Italian data. They managed to get for math teachers measures of implicit stereotypes. So they have an implicit association test. And what they show is that young girls that are assigned to teachers that have stronger gender stereotypes, gender science stereotypes, tend to underperform on math tests and tend to be much less confident about their math skills. Right? So you expose me to a teacher that makes more salient that as a girl I should not be doing well, I do more poorly, I become less confident. We also have good macro level evidence that speaks to this matter. So this is PISA data. You can see indeed, not in every country, but in the majority of countries, men do better than women on the math part of the PISA test. But you also see that there's quite a lot of differences across countries. Now, 2 papers that suggest that these differences across countries are just not random, but are systematic, are one a paper by my colleague Luigi Zingales and co-authors, another one by Claudia Sanik, that tell the same story. But this is, gender gap in math in yellow and reading across a set of countries. This is a measure of gender attitudes across these countries. And you can see clearly that the stronger, the more conservative the gender attitudes are in a place, the bigger the gender gap in mass ends up. I really like this picture as well from Claudia's work. It's looking at Europe, but it's contrasting European countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc to countries that were never part of the Soviet bloc. So there's lots of things that went wrong with the Soviets, but one of the things they really tried to do, for reasons that may have simply to do with economic development, is like to try to get as many women in the workforce as possible. So what Claudia does is kind of go and look today at the gender gap in mass between Western European countries and Eastern European countries, those that were part of the Soviet bloc. And you see these sharp differences. The gender gap in mass is systematically much smaller in the Eastern Bloc countries than in Western European countries. All of these speak to the same fact. I think I'm just going to skip this to make sure that I can conclude. So, where am I? I think I've tried to provide you evidence about view 2, right? I tried to provide you evidence that, we should not view preferences as given. Preferences are endogenous to stereotype. We should not view skills and gender different skills as given, but we should also view them as being endogenous to stereotype. What I feel like I need to do and take a moment on is, okay, but beyond kind of what I've said, how much evidence do we have that there are essential differences between the gender? Which is a really complicated question to address empirically, given all that I've told you, right? Given I told you that these preferences, these traits, these skills are likely endogenous stereotypes. But to the extent that we want to be brave and try to look at the data, what does the data say, right? Are there systematic differences? And, if there are systematic differences, are the beliefs we have about these differences accurate, right? Which would be, I guess, a good thing, because that would mean that at least what's happening is more efficient or fair. All right. So this is literature that is totally outside of my area, but I think it's really worth reading, where people do meta-analysis, and the name you should have in mind is Janet Hyde, who's done the most important work on this. But to the extent that we've done lots and lots of work, measuring gender differences on tons of traits and skills, what does the data say? Not one paper at a time, which I think we tend to do, but really by seriously trying to aggregate all of the findings together. Right. Common way to summarize these gender differences is a Cohen-D statistic, which is basically differences between mean for males and women divided by some kind of measure of the pools within group standard deviation. Right. This is kind of like, to give you a sense, if you've never looked at the statistic before, this represents a D of 0.21, right? So that's a distribution for women of that particular trait and for men of that particular trait. You can see that at 0.21, the distribution are essentially right on top of each other. There are small differences in means, you can see it, but essentially the distribution overlap with one another, right? So in this literature, what you're interested in is, kind of how much of these differences are more in the 0.2 or less measures versus more than that. And my reading of this work, again, I recommend this paper by Janet Hyde, if not read them, if not seen them before, is that overall what seems to emerge is a gender similarities hypothesis. For most of the traits, and there's been hundreds of them, people have been studying across, dozens and dozens of studies, the picture that you observe are not very different from that. So yes, there are small differences between men and women, but the between gender differences on that trait of skill is swamped by the within gender differences that exist on that trait. Okay? So gender similarity hypothesis seems to be the main thing that emerged. Now, it is not true for everything, and there do exist a few traits where the Cohen-D statistics are larger than that. And this is kind of the list, cutting and pasting from our paper, but some that I think I will stress is measure of like empathy, tenderness, willingness to be interested in people rather than things, right? If you have read Ali G's cousin book, whose title I forgot, kind of that's one of the first things you measure with babies, right? So like little baby girls are going to be more interested in looking at faces, and little baby boys are going to be less interested in that. It is true that when you measure these things, in adulthood as well, this is where you see the biggest gap. Okay? All right. So, with respect to like accuracy, again, very little work in economics here, more work in psychology, even though we're starting to see work in economics, such as by my fantastic colleague, Heather Sarsons. The psych literature, I think, provides mixed results as to how accurate, our views about the differences between the genders are. And it's kind of a mixed bag of a literature. There's one paper, though, and that will be kind of the last thing I will mention before talking briefly about policy, that I think tells me something about what could be still kind of really important in this area, and I think it's relevant to the motherhood penalty. It's a paper by Nick Epley, psychologist, also a colleague of mine, and what this paper does is basically kind of test the following hypothesis, that all stereotypes will tend to be particularly inaccurate, exaggerated, for things that come to mind when we think about what is different between men and women. Right? So if I were to ask you what's different between men and women, what would you answer? Well, they asked that to a set of subjects, and this is what they found. Happiness, not really. We don't think that happiness is particularly a man thing or a woman thing. No. Carefulness, depression, no. But what things that come to mind when we think about what defines a man and a woman have more to do with empathy. We think that women have more of that. And, aggressiveness, we think that men have got more of that. Those are the first things that come to mind when you ask people what's different between a man and a woman. And what they show in this paper is that for those traits, just look at this one, those traits that immediately come to mind when we think about men and women, our beliefs tend to be exaggerated, right? So this is empathy, and this is basically women and men. This is how well they perform on an empathy test. And you can see that there is a gender differences. Women are more empathetic than men are, consistent with what I told you from this meta-analysis. But what is striking is that we don't have those beliefs well calibrated. We tend to exaggerate. Women tend to believe that men are way less empathetic than they actually are, and men tend to believe that women are way more empathetic than they actually are. Right? So this is an area where, at the core, the way I would summarize this is that there is a kernel of truth, and these ideas with the kernel of truth, we tend to have the more kind of miscalibrated beliefs about others. And tying this back to prescriptive stereotypes, so it is true that women care more and likely care better than men do, but what they are expected, the amount to which they expected to care is out of line with how much more they care than men, if that makes any sense. Right? All right, okay. And I just want to make sure, how many more minutes do I have? I can keep on going for 10? Maybe 5? Okay, I'll do 5. All right. So I'll go very briefly over policy. I think this is another paper that looks at a very long time series of how things have changed. Right? And I think it's consistent with what I just told you about, this kernel of truth and, kind of this exaggeration of the empathy differences between men and women and how they may change, they affect the way we, kind of we behave. Over time, kind of do survey data and ask people, is this trait more true of women or men or about equal? And they ask this question for things like agency, competence, intelligence. And the picture that emerges is that there's been a huge amount of progress. In the old days, kind of people used to believe that intelligence was really a man's trait. And now, you don't see these differences anymore. Same for competence, same for agency. What has remained, to be viewed as a woman's trait is what they call communion, and if you read it, it's really this measure of empathy. So, in a sense, it's one of the stereotypes that has been the hardest to get around, and it's kind of interesting why. One view could be that it's kind of a positive one. It's kind of nice to be empathetic, unlike saying that women are just less intelligent. So there's something about this stereotype that makes it particularly harder to get around. All right, so 5 minutes, what do I do with all of this? I mean, I think at the core, if you believe, kind of what I've been saying, what should we be doing? What are the next steps? Probably, definitely not take it as a given, but trying to fight these stereotypes and at least make them more, more accurate. So I believe that research, all that we do, that maybe many of you will be doing next, is really important here. And this is an area where I very much worry about publication bias. People, journals, newspapers are interested in talking about stories where they find that men and women are different. That means that those stories get way more attention than the papers that find no gender differences, that don't get published. I think we need to be way more careful. We need more pre-analysis plan and registration of studies for work inside, for work in the lab, and really to do more of this meta-analysis. So I believe that as researchers we play an important role. I think there's also an important role for educators, for the media, and for research. Here's one picture from a paper by Anjali Adukia, who's a colleague at the Harris School of Public Policy at Chicago. And she did this fantastic kind of forensic work looking at the books that our children read. Kind of Caldecott Medal, we've read a lot of these books. And then she went and dissected these books to try to figure out, what are the fraction of words in these books that we give our children that come from men versus women. And you can see, right, this mainstream collection, which is like the main ones you're aware of, that there are 35% of words, come from women. Why not 50%? She also has this kind of great picture that says that there's more women's faces than women's words. So you can see the faces of women in these books, but they just don't say much. They sit in the background. I mean, obviously, this is part of the education that, kind of will lead to the continuation of these gender roles and gender norms, and this is important for us to rectify that. Second thing I'll say is that sounds obvious, but the best way we fight stereotypes is by creating counter-stereotypical examples. And maybe that sounds like putting the carriage before the horse, but the more we can get women in the workforce and doing well, right, the easier it will be to undo any kind of remaining stereotypes that exist out there. And we have lots of evidence that, this is true, the best being Michael Fernandez's work on women's work during the Second War. So I think it's important that we don't mess it up with policies that make it harder for women to work, right? Olivetti and Petongolo have said a lot about, very overextended maternity leave that can be detrimental to women, especially the more educated women. There's a lot to think about with our tax code, right? That makes it, does not align, kind of moms or married women's incentive with work. Like the German tax code basically means that the average tax rate for a single woman is like 30%, while the average marginal tax rate for a married woman is 50%. This tax code is really getting in the way of, creating more of these counter-stereotypical examples with women in the workforce. We need more gender-neutral policies, kind of childcare and early education are obviously really important. And we probably need more, attempts to create counter-stereotypical behaviors such as Scandinavians' effort with the quotas. And, I think the men's quotas, I think, are important. And, kind of more countries beyond Scandinavia should be, investing in them. I'll go very quickly. I think there's more that we need to do to de-bias organization. I think we know a lot about when biases and stereotypes tend to creep in, kind of think about Danny Kahneman's System 1, passive automatic versus kind of slower, more conscious thinking, which is less subject to stereotypes. How do we create workplaces where, we make sure that people think a lot before making decisions or judging others. And then, I know I'm rushing, but that's the final thing I will say is, if we cannot, easily kind of correct the stereotypes, then are there other things that we can do, right? And I think that it's really about organizational practices and changing the workplace. And my sense is that a lot of what has been happening inside of the workplace has been going in the wrong direction, right? If you think about the educated part of the labor market, there's a sense that these occupations are becoming less and less flexible, that the demand on our time are making it harder and harder for women to, kind of provide the inflexibility that is required of them. If you think about the lower skilled occupations in the economy, you have the same tendency. In the US, we have a lot of just-in-time scheduling and software that are basically making it very difficult for women to be able to, kind of provide all that is required for them given this technology. And it nearly feels like a public good problem because every firm is kind of using the latest technology, not understanding that these technologies are, negatively impacting the quality and the size of the pool of talents that, can be supplied. And then, I think one of the questions that will be, occupying, I think, many people interested in gender inequality is this one, which is like the new workplace that we're going to be looking at post-COVID. Will it be a workplace that's better for women? And I think there's a tendency to say, yes, of course, right? Because this workplace will create more flexibility. I can now work from home, right? And it will also make location matter less. I told you before that women kind of are looking at a narrow set of options because they need to have a job that's close to their home. Well, if now we can work, for a company based in another country, that should help women. But on the other hand, I wonder whether working from home is really much more flexible. That's not been, my full experience during COVID, where expectations about, kind of when work starts kind of feel like have been shifting. And for this to work, it also has to be that if people are working from home, there will be gender balance in who's taking care of the other things that are happening at home besides work. And that's really the last picture I'll leave you with. This is a recent paper that has looked at our occupation, academia, and what's been happening during the pandemic, where both, kind of men and women were basically at home, supposedly writing papers, but also, kind of taking care of children. And very clearly, kind of women's hours spent on research has been impacted way more than men's hours spent on research during this pandemic. So if that's what the work of the future is going to be looking like, it's not so clear that, this post-COVID new workplace is really going to work much better for women. All right, I'm done. I think this is, as I said, an area of steady progress. There's still a lot of really important questions. Obviously, hopefully, I've convinced you that the tool of economics are great, but I think that this is an area where we need to, I think, rely on other things than economics. Cognitive psychology has played a very important part in changing the face of economics over the last, 30 years. I think social psych is also an area where, there's lots for us to learn and to try to incorporate more in our papers and our understanding of the world. I'll finish here. I'm sorry I went too long. Thank you so much for listening to me.
I think we have time for one or two questions. Libertad? There is a micro, maybe. Micro the...
Oh, I can go there.
No.
Thank you, Marianne. That was really great. I have many questions, but I'll start with maybe one or two since we don't have a lot of time. So the first one is about, stereotypes. You're saying this is probably important, understanding remaining gender gaps. So my question is, when we think about policy, to what extent do you think we can aim for changing gender stereotypes kind of in the short term, thinking of, adults today who are already in the labor market? If we extend paternity leave now, do we expect today's adults to really readjust their gender roles and the way they, specialize in the household and in the market? Or should we think of changing gender roles as more of a, long-term thing, which is, kind of suggesting that it's going to take a long time if we have to wait, for the next generation to observe their fathers taking more paternity leave. So to what extent is this a short versus a very long-term thing? And my second question is about the, flexibility literature, thinking about Claudia Golden's papers and what you said. So I have the feeling that, these papers that suggest that, what we need for, for the gender gap in the labor market to go away is to kind of allow for more flexibility in all kinds of jobs so that women can work and still, take care of their children and be more at home. And I always worried that this is kind of taking it as a given that women are the main caregivers and
Yep.
they are going to demand and use this flexibility, but this doesn't really go to the core gap, which is the fact that women are the ones that specialize in the home, right?
Yep. No,
Okay.
these are two great questions, and I certainly don't have any great answers with respect to your first one. I tend to view it also as a kind of longer-term phenomenon. I mean, we believe in all the work that we've seen on like how you change norms and how you change kind of these attitudes is really kind of one generation, kind of providing another example for the next generations. I think a lot of it is indeed kind of more longer term. I think there's been a bit of excitement about obviously the last 2 years might have been important in changing some of these dynamics. We'll see. I don't strongly believe it. So yes, I think unfortunately kind of more longer term. Now on the other hand, if you look at Scandinavia's and the take up of like the daddy quotas, there's a sense that like they are kind of you get to a point where it becomes a reputational thing to actually take it on. Like your peers expect you to be staying at home with the children, so maybe that can be a little faster, but mostly I think a longer term thing. With respect to your other point about the flexibility, again I totally agree with you. Kind of flexibility matters more to women than men because of these stereotypes and these gender norms. It is not so clear that kind of building more flexibility is really helping. At least it's helping in keeping more women in the workplace. It's not really kind of addressing the gender gap. What I still find interesting is that there might be under experimentation in a lot of organizations as to whether they would be able to provide more flexibility without actually having any decline in productivity that would have to translate into lower pay. So I do believe that kind of companies may experiment more with different ways of organizing work that ultimately may help.
I think I have a question of Mark. No, yeah, Mark. Yes. No, Mark.
So thank you, Marianne. This was an amazing presentation. I'm not sure I enjoyed it because it was extremely triggering, and I'm sure that as many of the women in the room, we have examples for every single form of discrimination that you mentioned in pretty graphical ways. So I had a question on the div in div about the impact of motherhood. I worry that people will take away from that we are only penalized conditional on having women, on having children. And that's not at all my experience. People anticipate that you will have children and therefore discriminate you on the basis of that. So on that Danish study, can they separate the ex-ante discrimination versus the exposed discrimination?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. And again, the most striking part of all of these studies, let me find them. And hold on, sorry. Here is that kind of you don't see much anticipation of anything. You know what I'm saying? So and when we did the work on the MBAs now, say it again? Maybe a little bit, but I mean, I think kind of look, I mean, it's all kind of the same here between men and women. I think evidences of like clear pre-trans are just not there. When we did the work on the MBAs, and I know kind of Rosa, you've also worked at the lawyers' data, so I don't know whether you were able to look at like the pre-trans, but the MBA stuff was like striking. There was just really nothing happening before the birth of the first child. Even though you would think that even the woman may have decided, well, I'm going to slow it down. So, but you're right. Kind of if you want to, it is important to look at the pre-trans, and maybe I didn't do a good job. I think if you go back to these papers, I think they take these pre-trans very seriously. Don't find much evidence for them.
Yeah, I forget about the pre-trans.
Okay, I see. Yeah. So I'll have to think more about what they do and think about that.
Yes, maybe.
But I guess, sorry, the other way, sorry, the other part of the answer, Mar. Again, I'm just going to rely on one paper, but like, if I were to when I present this work and I get this question, if you look at, this is ours work, but I showed you the same thing with making this earnings, you would essentially find that this coefficient here is 0, right? So this group is no different than men. So there's no level differences, essentially. It all starts happening when the children are being born. Yep.
Yeah. Yes, there's a question over there.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I just had one question regarding positive discrimination with gender quotes. I was wondering if, from your perspective, it's a good method in order to achieve equality at the workplace, or instead it can backfire and weaken the female's perspective.
You're talking about quotas, right? Gender quotas?
Yeah, exactly.
So
that's what you mentioned before.
Sorry, this was one of the things that I skipped, but I can go quickly to here. No, I don't know. Okay, it was over there. Yeah, so I think that my view of the quotas, which is somewhat informed by, having studied the very first one of them, which is the one that happened in Norway back in the early 2000s, and the form of the quotas in Norway. I'm assuming you have quotas. You have gender quotas in Spain as well, right? Kind of probably not very different. So like 40% of the seats on the board of these, kind of publicly traded companies are going to be reserved for women. My reading of what happened empirically first, and then I'll tell you kind of what I think it generalized, is that these quotas didn't do much. So they succeeded at one thing. Like companies were told they had to find 40% of women to put on their board, and they kind of didn't want to do it, said they couldn't find women that were qualified enough to do this job. Once you told them they had to do it, they did manage to find very qualified women to sit on the board. So quotas mattered in making the boardroom more gender equal, which in itself may have lots of good implications for like, ESG decisions, a lot of things that we may be interested for corporations to do. But, if we think about this as a policy to create more equality in the in the labor market, it failed. Right? You brought more women to the workroom, okay, so like, a couple hundred women got a job on the board because of this. Obviously, for this policy to be first order, it has to start kind of trickling down, right? Then more women in the boardroom means more women in the C-suite, means more women, in executive position inside of the company, and so on and so on. In the Norwegian context, we looked, we found none of that. So you had the direct impact of the quotas, that worked, but nothing beyond the changes in the boardroom. And, from my perspective, I don't think that is so surprising if you believe the stories that I told you, right? So it's not clear that, the quota, how would the quota work? Because of homophily, because, kind of women that are on the board will know more other women that could be appointed to the C-suite. Yes, maybe that's all true, but if these forces are not first order, unlike some of the factors that I stress, it's not clear the quotas are going to be doing much. So I'm very skeptical about the quotas as like, okay, we done, we check the box, which I think has been my impression in some European countries is that, okay, we've done that, now we're done, and we have solved issues of gender inequality, in the corporate sector.
Okay, I think we can take the last question. There was a question back, and then we have Jose, and we will finish with the last question on the previous and last.
Pardon me. So thank you, first of all, for this very interesting presentation. My question regards the classification between higher paying jobs and lower paying jobs, because in the beginning you said that in higher paying jobs such as tech, there's a lower wage gap, and then in lower paying jobs the wage gap increases. But I was wondering in how far this is really a fact of life, so to say. Because when I think of tech, like 50 years ago, there was many women, and as men entered into the sector, kind of the wage level increased. And if we look, for example, at the medical profession, as men entered the medical sector, kind of the wage increased, and with it the differences. And so so my question really is, what led you to the conclusion that some sectors are generally higher paying and some lower paying? Because I believe that maybe stereotypes might also affect how well certain jobs are paid.
Yeah, all of that you said is true. And again, so I'll just very briefly go over this again. So this is not my work, this is Claudia's work, but kind of as a connection to the work we did with the MBAs. The main thing. So how did she end up with these dots? These are simply like look for the highest paying occupations in the U.S. This is the list. So look at occupations that pay a lot of money. That's the way it's being defined. The thing that I was trying to stress, and maybe I was not clear, maybe I did not make the connection, is that the importance of STEM is that you can see these kind of more STEM jobs over here. They're over here. They're not down there, right? So these are jobs. If you become a computer scientist, where the gender gap in earnings between men computer scientists and women computer scientists is not as large as the gender gap in earnings between, woman corporate executive and a man corporate executive. Right? And there's a reason for this. And this reason is arguably on this picture, is that these careers in the tech are more flexible than being a businessman or being a lawyer. Right? So you work an extra hour, you work an extra 1% of time, you get an extra 1% increase in compensation, not 10% increase in compensation. That would be a more inflexible platform.
Thank you.
We take the last question, maybe, or well, two more, and that last two, okay?
Thank you for the presentation. If I understood you well, you said that we should apply gender-neutral policies to allow women to work. However, when you apply gender-neutral policies, because gender norms are traditional, women ended up doing everything. So shouldn't we make positive discrimination to encourage men to take his part in childcare? Shouldn't we make incentives in the companies so that we speed up most of the changes? Shouldn't we focus more on men rather than women? Thank you.
It's a great question, and I don't know that I have like a lot of like evidence. So maybe some of it is like my own instinct, in terms of answering this question. I think the reason why I like gender-neutral policies is that they take the gender out of it, and by definition, and that's a good thing to have. But your point is very well taken, right? And I think we have we do have growing evidence that gender-neutral policies may, at least in the transition period, kind of backfire, such as the work on the extension of the tenure clock, for example, for male and female academics that have children. I think at the core, though, kind of being able to stop talking about gender, so not having lectures like this one, I think is kind of the end goal. And hence, kind of my preferences for things that are more gender neutral. But at the same time, I just told you that I think the ideas of like daddy quotas, for example, is a great one, and that we should create additional incentives for men to change the way they spend their time. So I guess I'm contradicting myself. I hear your question.
La última pregunta.
Thanks, Marianne. Just wanted to go back to the stereotypes issue and think about one situation in which women change their preferences, or there is a selection process in which the women that arrive to the positions that, they climb the ladder and go to the higher stand, they have a higher level of implicit association. When you test them, they have a high implicit association test in science against women. So they have a stereotype like men, at the same level as men. So many times when we think about academics and research centers, we think that committees that are more gender equal, so you have more women in them, are going to be much better for women. But at the end, I tell you my experience, you take 18 biology research centers and you test the implicit association in science, and in the postdocs, men and women have more or less the same. There is no bias. But when you climb the ladder, they still have the same level, but it's more of a stereotype against women in science. Yeah. So it looks like some of the procedures that we're using in academia to try to solve this problem are not solving the problem because there is some selection or some preference change. Yeah. What do you think about that?
No, I think it's, so I haven't seen the research that you mentioned. I'd love to see it, so if you can send me a link, that would be great. But that, I think another part of the answer to, kind of what do I think about quotas is that, kind of that I didn't provide, but I think I also think about a lot, is that it's not, the quotas are based on the idea that women in position of power watch out for other women. And, it's not immediately clear that will happen. And in fact, some of the best empirical work that we have on this from, I think, Manuel Bagues, that is used, I think, kind of some Spanish exam, if I remember well, from here. This exam, suggests that, those dynamics are not the one that happen. But the reason why that, kind of this is happening may be multiple. Maybe women that are, on the selection committee may be particularly concerned about what other people will think of her, that she's biased and all of that. But at the core, in a reduced form where it is far from obvious that, by putting more women at the top of an organization or in selection, you will end up with this woman favoring or being more equal or fair.
Thank you very much, Professor Bertrand. I will say a couple of words very fast, very brief, in Catalan, as welcoming the course. Benvinguts a tots al curs 2021-2022, especialment a la nova generació d'estudiants. Estic molt satisfet perquè molts he vist per aquí de primer. Heu vist que l'economia no és tan difícil, és molt interessant i realment diu coses molt properes a nosaltres, a tots nosaltres, tant des del punt de vista del que ens interessa com a recerca, com a economistes, però personalment també. Jo tinc dues filles que han entrat molt recentment al mercat de treball i, per tant, ens afecta a tots el que s'ha parlat avui. Sols voldria destacar, com cada any, el privilegi que tenim tots d'estar a una universitat pública, de qualitat, i realment el professorat es contracta a nivell internacional de manera competitiva. El nostre personal de serveis i administració és de primera línia, molt eficient, i vosaltres, estudiants, són els millors que tenim per aquí, pel nostre entorn. Les notes d'accés ho mostren cada any. És un privilegi, és un compromís per tots nosaltres, especialment pels estudiants també. Penso que no heu d'entrar al mercat de treball de manera prematura. Sí que si teniu necessitat podem lluitar tots junts, amb els companys i companyes sé que estan també al costat vostre per demanar més beques i dedicar-vos 100% a la vida universitària. Són aquests anys que us heu d'aprofitar al màxim tots els recursos que tenim. I bé, tenim a la vostra disposició a tothom aquí a la facultat per aquest objectiu. Recordar-vos també que hi ha moltes associacions i moltes activitats i que és realment molt important que doneu vida aquí a la facultat i, per tant, que realment feu vida universitària, com en totes les paraules, no són les classes, sinó tota la resta que es pot oferir la universitat. Bé, no vull estendre més. Benvinguts a tothom al curs 2021-2022. Bon curs. Moltes gràcies.
Benvolgut degà. Dear Professor Bertrand, moltes gràcies per les vostres paraules. Many thanks, Marianne, for your presentation. Very inspiring. You've seen that in a Mediterranean country like our country. You can see that 2 questions can be 10 or 12. And this is a clear proof of the great interest and inspiring ideas you have explained. L'acte d'avui ja arriba al final. Inaugurem, doncs, el curs 21-22 de la Facultat d'Economia i Empresa. Moltes gràcies. Thanks a lot.